Hey guys, this is Ali from Learn Awesome, and today's video is about HTML forms. Forms are essential part of any dynamic website and allow user to enter data that is sent to server for processing. Any interactive website is incomplete without it, and that is why knowing about it is so critical. If you came to this page, chances are you use some sort of form like on Google or YouTube or a search engine of your choice. If you give me a nice comment after watching this video, you would again use a form. So you have been using web forms whether you knew it or not. Now it's time to be on the other side and know how to create them. Note that I have made this a two-part series where this video would cover form basics and controls, while the next would cover some styling considerations, input validation, and submission. Setting expectations straight, by end of this video, you would be aware of and definitely not be a master of various input controls that are used to gather data from the user, as we don't have an eternity, but you would be functional and good to go with the essential basics. So let's get started. Interactivity on web page can take many shapes and forms. Most but not all is provided by web forms. If you interact with this video like pause it, web forms are not involved. But if you say you search for another video on this page, you are using a form. In modern websites, forms have taken a bit of backseat with JavaScript and JavaScript-based framework allowing you to directly add form elements on the page and sending data manually to the server on say click events. Forms still remain the standard way of interactivity, even with these options encroaching heavily into its domain. So, yes, you can get around without using forms, but any scenario where collecting data from user is required, they present the best tool to do so. Forms have evolved over decades and so are a useful element for a whole lot of use cases. Though in simplest form, they are used to collect data from user and send directly to server. Modern forms coupled with JavaScript allow you to do many other things like input validation on the client side. And if the form is being used to perform some operations on client side, like say switching from light to dark mode, the server may be bypassed completely. We shall learn about it, but let's start with basics first. Forms are best understood by hands-on practice, and that is what we shall do after this slide. But let's just take a quick look at the basic elements that make up a form, commonly referred to as widgets. And as you might have guessed by now, form is a container element that is made up of other elements or input fields, some of which are text input, both single and multi-line, which are used to gather data in the form of text, number, password, email, telephone, URL. And then there are purposeful input controls, which are purpose-built for specialized data gathering, like date, time, color, and file pickers, which allow you to interactively select date, time, color, and files, checkboxes and radio buttons, select boxes, and range selection. Forms also come with autocomplete options, where you can provide suggestions to complete the input to the user using various techniques, and then there are submit and reset buttons. We'll look at all of these options in this video. It's time to go to Visual Studio Code and start creating our forms. Alright, here we are in Visual Studio Code. Let's create a web page and start the preview using the live preview extension from Microsoft for Visual Studio Code. Okay. Before we start writing code, note that forms like tables have code that is easier to write and harder to modify later. So it is always a good idea to think and design your form off the screen before starting to write it. What is essential data you want to collect? What would be the best controls to use? What data can be avoided? As you must be aware, filling in forms is not your favorite activity, and everyone hates forms that have tons of required fields. Most forms have a few required and some or more optional fields which can be ignored by the user. This is essential thinking, as a frustrated user is commonly a lost user, and knowing this is as important as knowing how to write the form code. I would argue it's much more important, as a badly designed form would be used mostly by yourself and your QA guys, which might be, again, yourself, but not the users. So let's continue writing our code and write a form element. I'm going to start by typing in HTML and select the second option, which is going to give us the scaffolding for our web document. I'm going to call it HTML forms demo, and let's start. So we just wrote our empty form element, which is going to do nothing as yet as input fields remain. But we have configured it to submit collected data to a particular URL on your server when user presses submit button and use the post HTTP method to send the data. More formally, action attribute defines the URL where collected data would be sent when a form is submitted. By submitted, I mean users pressing a submit button. Method is a value from a specific list of verbs from HTTP protocol, which control how our data should be sent from client to server. There are a couple of choices, but we shall discuss only two here, which are get and post. This is essential background knowledge, so let me switch back to PowerPoint to give you a better introduction. So we are going to deviate a bit from HTTP forms and talk a little bit about HTTP. So HTTP is a request response protocol between client and server. Client or browser sends HTTP requests to the server and server returns a response to the client. There are a couple of HTTP method choices available like get, post, put, delete, etc. Get and post are most frequently used. The difference is pretty simple. Using get, the data is sent to server in the URL of the get request. You can actually see your data appear in the web browser URL like this. It is generally used to request resources from the web server. Post requests, on the other hand, are generally used to create data on the web server, like adding entry to database with user information entered in a form. The data sent is not as public as in the GET request, as it is not visible in the URL and is part of the body of the request. There is no hard rule when it comes to form of which type of request you can use. You are at liberty to choose. However, one must understand that GET requests are public in nature. They can be bookmarked, cached, stored in browser history, limited in length, and restricted to ASCII characters. Since part of URL, they are visible to everyone in logs, etc., with little to no effort. You won't want your password being announced to the world in a GET request URL, would you? In contrast, POST requests, though not encrypted by default, are not as visible to the world as GET requests. However, that is where the safety ends. The data is still insecure to a determined sniffer or attacker. The only way to ensure safe transfer of information is by using HTTPS, which encrypts the data being transmitted. I have a full video on the topic of HTTPS on my channel as part of How Internet is Secured series. Please have a look if you are interested to know how secure communication is done over the internet with no background knowledge necessary by viewing that playlist. Coming back to the post, they can't be cached, stored, or bookmarked. They have no length or type restrictions. So lengthy binary data can be sent as well, unlike GET, which is restricted to 248 ASCII or text characters. There are other HTTP methods, details of which we won't go into at this moment, like put, which is used to update stuff on the server rather than creating it, or delete to delete existing record. Did I just went back on my own statement the second it came out of my mouth? Seems like I did. Well, I got carried away, but let's stop here. Last thing to note, since forms are generally used to create data, the post method is always the preferred choice. And with that, we go back to Visual Studio Code. So we can continue to add to our form and fill out its contents. We shall start by adding a text input element and its label, followed by same for email and address, and then a submit button. Let me increase the text size a bit. All right. So let me add some elements and then I'll explain. All right, our form is complete. Let's preview it in the live preview extension. Yay, our basic form is ready and we have only one word for it. Ugly. Let's do some basic fixes to make it a bit more bearable as it is not in current shape and form. For now, we shall use line breaks just to make everything appear in its own line. So let me make the text size a little bit smaller. I hope you can see that. All right, much more bearable. Our basic form is ready. Let's see it side by side. What did we do here? We added 3 input fields for user to enter his name, email, and address, and we also gave them their own respective labels to indicate the purpose of these input fields. Once done, we are pretty much ready to submit the gathered data to the server. As you probably noticed, we use the line break element here, which is not really a form child element. This is okay as there is no restriction on what HTML elements are allowed or not allowed inside a form. Every bit of good HTML in a form is fair game. You can use all the capabilities of HTML and CSS to make your forms look more stylish, pleasing, and functional. As a general rule, forms should be both mouse as well as keyboard friendly, and I can't emphasize the second part enough. Being keyboard friendly is critical for both desktop and mobile devices, and the step in right direction starts with an attribute called autofocus. Each form element has an autofocus attribute which indicates when form is loaded, that particular input field should have focus and ready to be typed in. Let me add that to the name field. Here we go and save. Unfortunately, the live preview is too primitive to showcase that, but let's have a look in Chrome. And here it is. Let me refresh. And as you can see, when the form is loaded, if I refresh it, the name attribute has focus and I can type and I can start filling in the name. And if you're unsure whether this is happening because of the autofocus, let me remove that and show you again. So if I refresh it, see, it's not focused. And if I type anything, nothing is happening in the form. So having autofocus attribute goes a long way in good UX. So I'll keep it there. Okay, let's turn our attention to label now and let's make some more modifications here, then I'll explain. And let me copy and paste the same for the email label. And we are done. What did we do here? We added a required indicator to name and email. Required is more important than you give it credit for. As I mentioned before, forms are one of the most hated part of any website and no one wants to fill them. That is why you get paid to fill in surveys and all. So making a minimal set of form fields as required goes a long way in making a good UX for your user and takes guesswork away from him. What is this ARIA label? ARIA or Accessible Rich Internet Applications labels are attributes that can be added to HTML elements to provide additional information about that element's purpose and functionality to assistive technologies such as screen readers. You should always design a web page keeping in mind users that are impaired and using assistive technologies like screen readers so that they are not left behind. Coming back to label tag itself. So what is this for attribute and what does it do? First off, it binds the label to the element whose ID is being specified as the attribute value. If you notice, each input element has a unique identifier as its ID attribute. The for attribute of label is referring to that ID. By binding, I mean that if you click on the label and not the input element, it would shift the focus to the input element, as if you clicked on the input element itself. Have a look as I click on email label. In addition, it is also really useful for screen readers and accessibility for users with disabilities. It is optional, so you can get away with it, but it is always recommended to use it. The other option, if you don't like the for attribute since it strains the memory, is to wrap the input element within the label and drop the for attribute, which does pretty much the same thing. Let me show you with this address element. So I'm going to drop this for attribute and wrap the input element inside. And let's check if it still works. So clicking on address, yes, the input element gets highlighted. Last thing about this for attribute, we haven't covered it yet, but for attribute is great if input element is a type of small items like checkboxes. So you don't have to narrow down your click to the checkbox. You can simply click the label to toggle the checkbox. In fact, it's just going to take a second, so why not show it? All right, so you see, if I need to check this checkbox, I either need to locate the checkbox and click on it, or I can just click anywhere on the label and click, and it works just as great. All right, enough time spent on labels. Let's move to some other items. Next up, let me introduce you a control which lets us group related elements together. And these are the field set and legend elements. So let's say I want to say that name and email are the primary personal information, and address and are you a developer seem to belong to additional information. So we are going to make two distinct groups of these input fields in the form. Right, so the way to do it would be to introduce a field set element, and you see a rectangle is appearing on top, and followed by we introduce a legend element inside, and observe that cut where we say personal information. And if I cut and paste name and email inside, there is a distinct group uh, grouping of name and email inside personal information. And I can do the same for rest of the fields. I say additional information, and here I would group these two together inside, and we have two distinct groups. This can be used creatively for a lot of use cases, like for example, you can have another section for interests. In fact, they can be nested to include, let's say I want to have a gender group inside personal information. So the way I'm going to do it is I would introduce a field set along with a legend called gender. And in here, I'm going to introduce two radio buttons for male and female. And the way to do it is input, where I'm going to use type equal to radio this time. And I'm going to call it gender male, name equal to gender. I'll explain it in a bit. And value equal to male. Right? See the radio button appearing? Let me copy paste in the interest of time. Introduce female. And we're good. You see the radio buttons are appearing, but without any labels, because you guessed it right, the label elements are missing here. So I'll introduce the label now. Label for equal to male, and I'm going to call it male, right? And copy paste, female, female. And we can also have a line break. And here we go. Name, email, and then a separate nested section for gender with its own radio buttons. Right, since we are on the topic of radio buttons, let me introduce you to the radio buttons. But before that, I need to press Shift Alt F to format everything in Visual Studio Code. And now let's have a look at the radio buttons input control. Right, so you have already observed the type needs to be specified to radio for these to occur. And then we specify an ID, which is used by this label elements for binding the label element with the input control. And this is followed by name and value, and they are definitely required. You might have noticed that I kept the name same for both the male and female radio buttons, and that was intentional. All radio buttons in the group must share the same name, right? And the value is something that is not shown to the user. The values that you are seeing on the screen are labels, not the values, but value is something that is sent to the server in response to the submit form operation. So when you select a value, let's say male, and click the submit form button, the browser is going to send name equal to value to the server. That is, gender equal to male would be sent to the server in response. What if I omit this value attribute? Then it is going to send gender equal to on to the server, which you can imagine is not going to make any sense. You must be tired of listening to what gets sent to the server from the browser. So by the time we reach this submit operation part of the video or the next video, we are going to create our own web server and have a look at what gets sent from the browser to the server. So for now, just keep in mind that for radio buttons, you must include names with the same value and value attributes with distinct values, keeping in mind those values are going to be sent to the server. Before moving past radio buttons, let me just remind you that checkboxes follow a similar pattern where the names must be kept the same in a group and the values are the ones sent to the server. And also there is a checked property which lets you make a default selection for the checkbox if there are multiple ones and you want one of them selected. Right, so all of these elements that we have seen so far are variants of input element, which I'm sure you might have guessed that is a true shapeshifter depending on the type attribute. While type is the most important attribute for the input element, there are other important ones which we can take a look into. So first off, let's start with a value attribute, which basically indicates value of the input element at the current moment, but we can always assign a default value. Let's say I can say a@p.com. And if I press the submit form at this point, this value is going to be sent to the server, but you can always edit it and make it x@y.com, and now x@y.com is going to be sent. So you can always have a default value. If I cut this, now the current value is empty, even though the default value was a@p.com. Right, I'm going to get rid of this from now on. Another very important attribute, which is really useful and you must have seen at a couple of places, is the placeholder. And placeholder is a grayed out text that appears in the input element describing the purpose of the input element. So see, and placeholder does not belong in the data sent when the submit form is pressed. It's a UX specific thing. So if I let's start typing anything, the placeholder is gonna go away. It's just there to guide the user about the purpose of the input element. Right. Another interesting feature that we are going to look into is going to be spell check. And to demonstrate that, I'm going to introduce a new new element called TextArea. Let me write its element and then I'm going to explain. Okay, and this is a multi-line text input control in contrast to input, which is a single line text input control. So if I write something like uh, fox. Okay, you see, it's letting me write a multi-line text here. So these calls and rows attributes determine what is going to be the width and height of the allowed text. So as you can see, the calls is the visible width of the text control and average character width. So it's a 20 character wide and 5 character or 5 rows deep or high multi-line text input control. And you can control the height and width using these default values and also control the instantaneous height and width using these grep on the bottom right corner. There's also another attribute called wrap, which gives you hard and soft values. Soft value makes the enter text just appear wrapped. That is, you would only see that wrapped in the browser. But the hard value is going to not only make the text wrap in the browser, but also introduce new lines in the text submitted to the server. So it gives you quite a bit of control. The interesting thing I wanted to talk to you about and introduce in this is the attribute called spellcheck, which can be given as true or false value. And if I press save, nothing is happening because this preview extension is too primitive for this newish control. So let me open this in the Chrome browser and drag it here. And if I reload this and click here, you see it is giving me these red swigglies underneath the spelling mistakes that I made. And if I right click, it gives me the spelling suggestions. Seriously, Lexley, lazy? Where's lazy? I think Chrome has gone lazy as well. So, all right, we can't fix it here. Right, we definitely can. I'm missing a label here, but that can be added later. Right, let's move on to our next control, which is going to be a very practical one, and that is password. So let me type it first, and here we go. So if I come here and start typing anything, you see it's not showing me the characters, it's showing me bullets. I'm sure you have used this kind of password control before on various forms when signing up or signing in, and that protects their password to be visible to anyone standing behind you. But do remember that this is just a UI gimmick, and the password is still sent in plain text to the server from the browser when you submit the form. So if you want to protect your password not only from prying eyes but also from sniffers or attackers during transit, then you must not only use post as the HTTP method, but also make sure you're using a HTTPS or TLS. Using HTTPS or TLS is gonna make things encrypted. So even if someone is able to get hold of what is being transmitted, they are not gonna make any sense of that. There's also a closely associated and another element called, in fact, just let me just copy paste it in the interest of time. And that is a hidden type input control. Now that hidden type input control, as you can see, does not appear anyone on the screen. It is hidden. So let's say you are generating a user ID, some sort of query, or through any other mechanism, you are generating an ID to be associated or some other sort of information that you want to be sent along with the form data to the server when the form is submitted, but you don't necessarily want user to be shown that information, then you can use hidden type controls. And yes, you must provide a value here so that something gets submitted along with the form. All right, we are already using the email here where we could type anything and it would just work. But a better option for using emails is to use an input control of type email. Well, it's here. As I mentioned, forms have evolved over the years or decades, and emails, passwords are the most common things used in a form. So that is why there is support for email type controls. And now if I type something, now if I want to submit this form with this value, which is definitely not an email, it would give me an error and perform some validation that please include an at the rate of sign in the email address. Your value is missing a the rate of sign. So this makes it useful to do some primitive input validation on the provided input. So if I type a at p.com, then it's not gonna complain. Okay, moving on. There's another cool option available in the form input element set, which is search. And I'm sure you have interacted with it before. And the type is search. You can name ID anything as long as it's consistent between label and this. I'm just gonna call it search, and so that would be usually present somewhere on top in its own form. It's not generally part of an input form with other fields. Search is usually a form with just one option because it's supposed to reload the page with the searched information and is not to be mingled with other fields, right? So, but for sake of this demo and time, I'm gonna keep it here. All right, so the way it is used is if I start typing anything, you notice this X sign comes up, which lets you clear the search. These are the sort of UI add-ons that are associated with search input control. Other than that, different browsers use the search input control differently. Some browsers are going to add rounded edges, but generally it's just this X part that differentiates search control from the rest and also makes it visible in your code. All right, next item is telephone. So, which is type equal to tel. I'm gonna just copy paste it. Copy and tel. And there's another important attribute that must be provided, which is pattern, which tells what kind of pattern do you want to your telephone input control to support. So generally it follows a set template. So I have copied it and I'm just gonna paste it here rather than typing it. And now if I go here and type anything that differs, it's gonna complain that please match the requested format here. And if I press the submit form, so perform some input validation based on the pattern that you provided here. Another control on the same pattern as tel would be URL, which I'm going to skip here because in the interest of time. Would just add that it would be accompanied with client-side validation for basic errors like HTTP missing. The important thing for these controls like tel, email, URL, etc. is that keypads on mobiles would change differently based on this input type control. So for example, for tel, the keypad would be a numeric keypad with plus sign and all. Similarly for URLs, forward slash colon, etc. would be included in the keypad. Right now we are using a desktop, so we cannot demonstrate that, but just keep that in mind that you are making your website for to be viewed in multiple type of devices which have their own keyboards, and specifying the type of control helps in other ways than just the UI that you are seeing on the screen. Right, next up, we are going to focus on something called a number field. So let me first type it and then let's see. Okay, why isn't it appearing? Right, something is wrong. Okay, here it is. We haven't been using line breaks, that's why there's a problem. So with the numeric input control, you see I can provide an age between 18 and 60 only. So if I let's say try to enter 2 and try to submit the form, it's gonna complain that value must be greater than or equal to 18, and I can make that happen. And see the interesting bit? If I press this, it takes me again straight away to the minimum specified here. And then you can control the age using the step counter here. You also have an option to change the step being used here. So if I use a step 3 and see, so you can play around with this input type number in all sort of creative ways. This step can also be in decimals. So I can say 0.5, for example. So now if I try doing this, it's gonna give me increments here. It doesn't make sense for age, but I'm just showing you the flexibility this control provides you. Right, next control would be range. So with this number control, we had very precise control on what value to enter, but sometimes we do not want such precise control. We want a kind of a range in which we just want to select a value. So let me type it first, and then we'll explain what I mean by that. So, all right, so we have a volume range control, which, as you can imagine, you are not very concerned whether the volume needs to be 50.3 or something. You just want an approximate range of volume to be adjusted based on the content that you are watching. So this gives you a slider kind of picker control, which you can adjust, your user can adjust. You can provide a default or starting value, which was 40 in our case, which kind of rendered this control with the selected value being shown somewhere at the 40% marker. And you have complete control on what min and max value to provide here. All right, the next control we need to cover is date time. Right. So what it does is it gives us this picker control to select date and time. So if I click on this calendar kind of marker, you see a complete control is shown to us where we can select not only the date with these arrows to select months and years, etc., but also for time. So a very useful control. So the appearance may vary from browser to browser, but generally it's the same. And there are a bunch of variants for this control. So let me show you some of them. So if let's say I am just interested in months, I'm gonna call it month, name equal to month, ID equal to month. And now I have a picker control that would only let me pick a month and not time or other things. Similarly, we can have a similar variant. Time, time. And here you see the marker changed and it just lets us pick the time. Similarly, there are other types available like just for year or week, but you can try them out on your own. There's another associated cool feature that I want to focus on, and let me type it first. Okay, so we have this control rendered where, in fact, let me make it 0.5 here, make it stand out. Okay, see, this gives you a very precise control. Let's say you are trying to book some flights or coordinating some date. So here we have a complete range defined where the user can pick. So the only options that are available for user to pick are between these date ranges that you specified. And I have given step equal to 2, so user can only pick alternate days, like he can only pick even dates at the moment. It doesn't make sense in this example, but just showing you the flexibility here. So if I make it step equal to 1, then it's just gonna be normal. You can pick between the minimum and maximum date any day in between. You must be wondering whether we can allow user to select working days only, but unfortunately that kind of support is not here. Another important thing I want to mention before we move ahead is that when I was typing this datetime local, you must have noticed there's another datetime option also appearing, but that might get deprecated soon. It used to contain the time zone information early on, but the support is being dropped because the time zone caused all sorts of confusion, whether the time zone is for the server or the client or whatnot. So just always use datetime local or date for selection. Since we are on topic of pickers, the next control would be a color picker. So I'm just gonna show this to you quickly as well because this is a very important one. Right, using American English here. All right, so if I select this value, you are presented with a color picker control where you can select your favorite color by using all these sliders and shades options available. You can also enter your favorite color manually. Like for example, if you just want red, you can type 25500 and then you're going to be presented with red and then you can select the shade from here. All kind of RGB values can be selected here along with other color palettes. The last picker we are going to consider would be the file picker, a very useful control. And here we are. So if I select choose file, you would be presented with the select file dialog where you can select a file. You can only select one and it would be sent to the server when you submit the form. There's another important property here, where did it go, called multiple, which allows you to select multiple files in the select file dialog. So if I now I can select multiple files and all of these would be uploaded to the server when you submit the form. So this input control has a bunch of variants, so you can also use it to upload video and audio files to the server as well by using except equal to video slash static or audio slash static. There's another way to use capture the camera or microphone feed directly from this input control using a capture value in this except, but I think that would get too advanced for this basic introductory video, so I'm gonna skip that for now. But just letting you know that that is possible. All right, that finally brings us to the end of input elements and its variants. Now we can shift our focus to another type of element, which is a select box. So let me type it first, like before, and then we are gonna see. Okay, we are done. I also did some cleanup on the form. So if I now go and try to select my favorite car, you can see it gives me three options: Ford, BMW, and Chevy in a drop down. So the way to do it is use a select element and then provide several options inside. So each option is listed as a separate line in the selection box, which you can select, and the value is selected. So we can make several variants of this select control. So let's say I want to create one with multiple groups which user can select from. So I'm going to type again. Right. Let's see what the selection has. And see, there are now two groups in the dropdown, one for German cars and one for Japanese cars, which you can choose from. A very nice and elegant UI if you want to present users to select from a dropdown with multiple groups to make it easy for him to make his choice. Can be used in all sort of ways. Sometimes you want to have a descriptive label but not want to submit that same label to the server. You just want to submit a particular ID value or a very short value to the server compared to the one being presented to the user to choose. So to do that, we also have another option, which I'm gonna type again. Right, here we are. We have several, let me format it first. Yes. So we have several descriptive options available to the user to choose from. So if we select the drop down, we see sporty and stylish BMW, elegant and luxurious Mercedes, and big luxury SUV Range Rover to choose from. But if I, let's say, choose the second option and press submit, then only the Mercedes is going to be sent to the server. And the elegant and luxurious part was only for the user to choose from. It was a UI thing only. All right, so far we have seen that we can only choose one option from the drop-down, but that can change. We can allow a user to choose multiple um, entries from the drop-down as well. For this, I need to come up with yet another control. So here goes. All right, here we are. So let's see what we have. So here we now have right, looks much better. So this control lets you choose multiple cars from the drop down. So you have the option of pressing control and making as many choices as possible, right? But there was a default option available, like we specified this selected against Audi, which made it the default selected option. But if you make any other selections, this is also possible. And of course, the sizes attribute controls the number of rows which are visible at any given time. Otherwise, a scroll bar would appear. So I guess 7 was the best value for this. Okay, that concludes our coverage of select element. So the last thing I want to cover now is autocomplete. So if you want to help user with suggestions during filling of the form, it can be done using an element called Datalist. A Datalist element can be associated with an input element using its list attribute. The option elements are used to present choices. ID must be specified to link those elements. So let me type it and then I'll show you what I mean. Right, so I have created an input control of regular text type and added a list attribute called my favorite car suggestions. And my favorite car suggestions include 5 or 6 sports car options here. So when the user starts to type, and you can also see that it is right, this browser is weird. It's presenting these options here. So user can choose from here as well. But if the user starts to type, let's say Lamborghini, Oh, that's why. There was a spelling mistake here due to which my tool was not working. So if I start typing now, the option would be available and I can choose it and it would immediately be filled. All right, we are approaching the 1 hour marker, so I think that's time to conclude this coverage of the form and input elements. I only hope you found this video informative and useful, and now you know a lot about those input controls and how to create some basic forms. In the next video, we are going to cover some styling aspects because this form definitely looks that it could need some styling. So with that, we are going to end this video here. Please like the video if you found the content useful and consider subscribing to the channel to get the notification for the next video and content. Thank you. Goodbye.